The night sky over Baghdad erupted in a symphony of explosions as the first Tomahawk cruise missiles found their targets. Operation Desert Storm had begun. It was January 17, 1991, the moment when warfare entered a new, technological era, and the world watched in awe as America unleashed its military might against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. 5 months earlier, Iraqi forces had stormed across the border into Kuwait, swiftly overwhelming the small oil-rich nation in less than 2 days. Saddam Hussein, flush with confidence after his 8-year war with Iran, believed the international community would accept his annexation of what he called Iraq's 19th province. He had gravely miscalculated. President George Bush stood before television cameras, his voice resolute. "This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait." Within days, American forces began deploying to Saudi Arabia under Operation Desert Shield, establishing a defensive position to prevent further Iraqi expansion while building a massive coalition force that would eventually number over 700,000 troops from 35 nations. This context is taken from the Washington Post's coverage of the initial deployment, which described it as the largest American military mobilization since Vietnam. As autumn turned to winter, diplomacy failed repeatedly. The United Nations had imposed crippling economic sanctions against Iraq and passed Resolution 678, authorizing coalition forces to use all necessary means to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait if they didn't withdraw by January 15, 1991. In Baghdad, Saddam remained defiant. His million-man army, the world's fourth largest, had fortified Kuwait with elaborate defensive positions, minefields, and oil-filled trenches ready to be ignited. Many military analysts predicted a bloody ground war with thousands of coalitions, casualties. Saddam himself warned of the mother of all battles. Behind closed doors at Central Command headquarters in Riyadh, General Norman Schwarzkopf finalized a battle plan that would revolutionize modern warfare. Rather than a frontal assault against Iraqi positions, Schwarzkopf envisioned a massive air campaign that would blind, isolate, and devastate Iraqi forces before any ground offensive began. As the January deadline approached, tension mounted throughout the Middle East. In Israel, civilians sealed rooms against potential chemical attacks and kept gas masks close. In Saudi Arabia, coalition troops made final preparations, writing letters home and checking equipment. Across America, families tied yellow ribbons around trees, symbols of hope for the safe return of loved ones deployed to a distant desert. When the ultimatum expired without Iraqi withdrawal, coalition aircraft and naval forces stood ready. At 2:38 in the morning local time on January 17th, the night sky over Baghdad lit up with anti-aircraft fire as the first wave of stealth fighters and cruise missiles struck command centers, air defense sites, and communications facilities. The Gulf War had begun, not with the expected ground assault, but with a precisely choreographed aerial ballet of destruction that would continue unabated for the next 42 days. Within hours, Iraq's sophisticated air defense network lay in ruins, its command structure paralyzed, and its ability to coordinate defenses severely compromised. As dawn broke over the Middle East, television viewers worldwide watched CNN's live footage of tracer fire and explosions illuminating Baghdad's skyline. The age of 24-hour war coverage had arrived alongside a new era of American military dominance. What would unfold over the coming weeks would fundamentally reshape perceptions of modern warfare and America's role in the post-Cold War world. The relentless drone of jet engines filled the Saudi skies as wave after wave of coalition aircraft launched northward. For 42 consecutive days, the air campaign hammered Iraqi positions with a precision and intensity never before witnessed in warfare. Operation Desert Storm had entered its defining phase, a systematic dismantling of Iraq's military machine from the air. General Chuck Horner, the air campaign commander, implemented a strategy built around round-the-clock sorties. We don't want them to sleep. We don't want them to eat. We don't want them to have a moment's rest, he told his pilots before the campaign began. By the second day, coalition forces had achieved near-total air supremacy, allowing attack aircraft to operate with virtual impunity over Iraqi and Kuwaiti territory. The technological gap between the adversaries became immediately apparent. F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters slipped undetected through Iraqi radar to deliver laser-guided bombs with pinpoint accuracy. Tomahawk cruise missiles navigated Baghdad's streets using primitive yet effective terrain-matching systems. Meanwhile, Iraq's Soviet-era defenses proved largely ineffective against these advanced weapons. This context is taken from Aviation Week and Space Technology's special report, which described the air campaign as the most concentrated application of air power in history. On the ground, Iraqi soldiers endured a nightmare of precision bombardment. The Pentagon released grainy black-and-white footage showing bombs disappearing down ventilation shafts and through specific windows of targeted buildings. These images, broadcast worldwide, created the impression of an almost surgical war, though later assessments would reveal more extensive collateral damage than initially acknowledged. By early February, the air campaign shifted its focus from strategic targets to the Republican Guard divisions entrenched in Kuwait. B-52 bombers, veterans of Vietnam, flew from bases as far away as Louisiana on 35-hour missions to carpet-bomb Iraqi positions. The psychological impact proved devastating. Many Iraqi soldiers later reported that the constant bombing prevented sleep, hot meals, or any semblance of normal military function for weeks on end. Saddam Hussein's response came in the form of Scud missile attacks against Israel and Saudi Arabia. Though militarily ineffective, these weapons carried the potential to fracture the coalition if Israel retaliated and drove Arab nations from the alliance. American Patriot missile batteries deployed to defend Israeli and Saudi cities, and special forces teams, the Scud Hunters, infiltrated western Iraq to locate and destroy mobile launchers. As February progressed, battle damage assessments indicated the systematic destruction of Iraq's combat capability. Intelligence reports suggested morale among Iraqi troops was collapsing. Thousands began surrendering even before ground operations commenced, often to unmanned reconnaissance drones or helicopter crews. In Washington, military planners watched with satisfaction as the enemy force that once appeared so formidable withered under the onslaught. Field reports estimated that Iraqi combat effectiveness had been reduced by over 70%. The Republican Guard, Hussein's elite force, had lost much of its heavy equipment and command structure. On February 24th, the air campaign reached its crescendo with over 3,000 sorties in a single 24-hour period. Highway 80, leading from Kuwait City to Basra, became a killing zone as retreating Iraqi convoys were caught in the open. The devastating attacks on this route, later dubbed the Highway of Death, would become one of the war's most controversial episodes. As the ground phase approached, coalition air power had accomplished what many military theorists had long considered impossible: virtually winning a war from the air. The stage was now set for what General Schwarzkopf called the Hail Mary play, a massive ground offensive that would take full advantage of an enemy already on the verge of collapse. While the world's attention remained fixed on the Kuwaiti border, General Schwarzkopf quietly executed what military historians would later call one of the most brilliant strategic maneuvers since World War II. Throughout January and early February, an elaborate deception operation convinced Iraqi intelligence that the main coalition attack would come directly into Kuwait and along the coastline. Meanwhile, far to the west, the U.S. 7th Corps and OST-8 Airborne Corps were secretly repositioning for what would become known as the left hook. The logistical feat was staggering. Under cover of night, over 200,000 troops with thousands of tanks and vehicles moved over 100 miles through the desert to new attack positions in western Saudi Arabia. To conceal this massive redeployment, coalition forces maintained a steady presence along the Kuwaiti border, with amphibious forces conducting rehearsals for a seaborne invasion that would never come. At 0400 hours, on February 24, 1991, the ground war officially began. While Marine divisions launched a frontal assault into Kuwait to fix Iraqi defenses, the main attack came from the west. The 7 Corps, led by Lieutenant General Frederick Franks, swung into southern Iraq with over 1,500 tanks in what would become the largest tank battle since the Second World War. This context is drawn from Military Review's analysis, which described the left hook as the decisive maneuver that transformed Desert Storm from a frontal slugging match into a war of rapid movement and envelopment. The speed of the advance shocked even coalition commanders. M1A1 Abrams tanks, proving vastly superior to Iraq's Soviet-built T-72s, moved at speeds of up to 40 miles per hour across the desert terrain. The Iraqi forces, having positioned their defenses to face south into Kuwait, suddenly found themselves being attacked from an unexpected direction, their trench networks and fortifications rendered useless. In the air, helicopter gunships and A-10 Thunderbolt Duseku, Warthog ground attack aircraft provided close air support, destroying Iraqi armor with devastating effect. The technological gap between the forces became painfully evident. American thermal sights allowed tank crews to engage targets through sandstorms and darkness, while Iraqi forces were effectively blind under the same conditions. By the second day, the advance had achieved stunning progress. American forces had penetrated over 50 miles into Iraqi territory, encountering pockets of fierce resistance, but generally finding an enemy in disarray. The vaunted Republican Guard, Iraq's elite force, attempted to reposition to meet this unexpected thrust, but found themselves constantly harassed by coalition air power that prevented effective movement. One Republican Guard officer, captured during the advance, reportedly told his interrogators, "We knew you would come from the sea. We knew you would come from the south, but we never expected you would come from the desert." This sentiment echoed throughout the Iraqi command as their defensive strategy collapsed. In Washington, Pentagon officials watched the rapid progress with mounting excitement. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell, both veterans of the agonizingly slow progress in Vietnam, marveled at the speed of operations. The ground war, initially planned to last weeks, was achieving its objectives in days, as coalition forces pressed deeper into Iraq, cutting off retreat routes for forces in Kuwait. Saddam Hussein's military found itself in an impossible position. Units either surrendered en masse or attempted to flee northward, where many were caught in devastating air attacks along exposed highways. By February 26th, the left hook had achieved its primary objective. The Iraqi army in Kuwait was encircled, with coalition forces positioned to completely destroy the Republican Guard divisions attempting to escape. The question was no longer whether Iraq would be defeated, but how complete that defeat would be. In a decisive meeting that evening, military commanders and civilian leadership faced the difficult question of whether to continue the advance toward Baghdad. The war's original objectives, the liberation of Kuwait and destruction of Iraq's offensive capability, had been largely accomplished. What came next would shape the political landscape of the Middle East for decades to come. The dust-caked tanks of the U.S. 1st Armored Division thundered across the desert floor as dawn broke on February 27, 1991. The massive formation, nicknamed Old Ironsides, engaged elements of the Tawakalna Division, the elite of Iraq's Republican Guard, in what would become known as the Battle of Medina Ridge. American M1A1 Abrams tanks opened fire at ranges exceeding 2 miles, destroying Iraqi T-72s before they could effectively respond. By midday, over 300 Iraqi tanks lay burning across the battlefield, with minimal American losses. Similar scenes unfolded across the theater as the ground campaign entered its fourth day. What military planners had estimated might take weeks was unfolding at breathtaking speed. The Iraqi army, once considered the world's fourth largest, was collapsing under the combined pressure of coalition forces attacking from multiple directions. "It's like a linebacker hitting a quarterback from the blind side," remarked one American commander as his forces swept around outflanked Iraqi positions. The speed and violence of the assault had shattered Iraqi command and control systems, leaving many units isolated and unaware of the overall strategic situation. This context is drawn from Time magazine's war coverage, which described the ground offensive as a military operation executed with such overwhelming force and precision that it redefined modern warfare. In Kuwait City, the first coalition forces, including Arab units deliberately chosen for political reasons, entered the capital to jubilant crowds waving Kuwaiti flags and pictures of the emir. Kuwaitis emerged from 100-day hiding to find their city looted, burning, and scarred by occupation. The retreating Iraqis had set fire to over 700 oil wells, creating an apocalyptic landscape of black smoke and burning petroleum that would take years to fully extinguish. To the north, the encirclement was nearly complete. The Republican Guard's attempted escape from Kuwait had turned into a desperate scramble as coalition aircraft pounded the congested Highway 80 running from Kuwait to Basra. The resulting destruction, miles of burned and abandoned vehicles, earned the route its grim nickname, the Highway of Death. As reports of the one-sided battle reached Washington, political considerations began to overtake military objectives. Television images of the highway carnage raised concerns about international perception. President Bush's national security team debated how thoroughly to destroy Iraq's military capability without creating the appearance of unnecessary slaughter. After exactly 100 hours of ground combat, at 8 a.m. local time on February 28th, President Bush declared a unilateral ceasefire. "Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated," he announced from the White House. Coalition forces had achieved their stated objectives, though many military commanders privately expressed frustration at not being allowed to complete the destruction of the Republican Guard. The ceasefire terms, hastily arranged at Safwan Airfield on March 3rd, permitted Iraq to fly helicopters, ostensibly for transport purposes, a concession that Saddam would later exploit to crush internal rebellions. The quick conclusion left Saddam Hussein in power, his most loyal military units damaged but not destroyed, and Iraq's internal political structure largely intact despite devastating losses. The final casualty figures revealed the lopsided nature of the conflict. Coalition forces suffered 148 combat deaths, while Iraqi military casualties numbered between 25,000 and 65,000, with thousands more wounded and approximately 85,000 taken prisoner. As coalition forces began their withdrawal, military analysts worldwide struggled to process the implications of what they had witnessed. The 100-hour ground war had demonstrated American military dominance in a manner few had thought possible. The technology gap, combined with superior training and leadership, had produced a victory so complete and rapid that it fundamentally altered perceptions of American military power. For the men and women returning home to ticker-tape parades, Desert Storm represented a watershed moment. The point when the ghosts of Vietnam were finally exorcised from the American psyche. Yet the rapid conclusion and limited objectives would leave unresolved questions that would draw America back to Iraq in the decades to come. The Gulf War revealed a revolution in military affairs that had been quietly developing since the Vietnam era. Television viewers worldwide watched in awe as precision-guided munitions found their targets with uncanny accuracy. Stealth aircraft penetrated supposedly impenetrable air defenses, and coalition forces coordinated complex operations with unprecedented synchronization. Desert Storm had unveiled a new American way of war focused on technological superiority, precision, and information dominance. At the heart of this revolution was the widespread integration of computer technology. For the first time in combat, satellite positioning systems, the predecessor to today's GPS, allowed commanders to navigate the featureless desert with pinpoint accuracy. The infamous left hook maneuver would have been unthinkable without this capability, as entire divisions relocated through unmarked terrain that Iraqi commanders had considered impassable. "We own the night" became a common refrain among coalition forces equipped with third-generation night vision technology. American tanks engaged Iraqi formations in complete darkness, their thermal sights detecting enemy heat signatures at ranges exceeding 2 miles. Iraqi commanders reported the terrifying experience of being engaged by an enemy they couldn't see, under conditions they considered combat prohibitive. This context is drawn from Foreign Affairs post-war analysis, which noted that Desert Storm represented the first information-age conflict, where control of the electromagnetic spectrum proved as decisive as control of territory. The air campaign demonstrated the coming-of-age of stealth technology. F-117 Nighthawk fighters constituted just 2% of the strike aircraft, but attacked over 40% of strategic targets. Despite flying over 1,200 combat sorties, not a single F-117 was lost or even damaged. The psychological impact on Iraqi defenders was profound. Their radar screens remained empty while explosions erupted throughout their positions. In command centers, officers utilized the nascent JSTARS, Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System aircraft, to monitor enemy movements in real time, directing strikes against formations as they repositioned. This capacity for battlefield awareness, derided by some military traditionalists during development, proved decisive in tracking and targeting the Republican Guard divisions attempting to escape encirclement. Precision-guided munitions, though, comprising only 7% of the ordnance dropped, accounted for most of the high-value targets destroyed. Laser-guided bombs demonstrated an accuracy measured in feet rather than yards, allowing strikes against specific buildings while minimizing collateral damage. The widely broadcast footage of bombs entering air shafts or specific windows transformed public expectations about modern warfare. The human implications of this technological revolution were equally significant. Coalition losses numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands, upending traditional calculations about the cost of major combat operations. Military planners who had estimated 10,000 American casualties found themselves pleasantly shocked by the actual figures. For the Iraqi forces on the receiving end, the experience was traumatic. Overwhelmed by an enemy they often couldn't see, couldn't hit, and couldn't escape, many surrendered at the first opportunity. One captured Iraqi colonel summarized his experience. "You cut our communications, you blinded our air defenses, you destroyed our command centers. We never saw you coming." The war's aftermath saw intense interest in American military technology from friends and potential foes alike. Nations worldwide recognized that conventional forces lacking these advanced systems would stand little chance against U.S. military power. Defense ministries scrambled to incorporate lessons from the conflict, while irregular forces began developing asymmetric strategies to counter American technological advantages. In Washington, the impressive performance reinforced a growing belief that technology could provide clean, quick victories with minimal casualties. This revolution in military affairs doctrine would profoundly influence American strategic thinking in the post-Cold War era, informing decisions about force structure, defense spending, and the willingness to use military power in future conflicts, as one senior Pentagon official noted after the war. Desert Storm represented not merely a victory, but a vindication, proof that American technological investment and doctrinal evolution had created a military force of unprecedented capability. The long-term implications of this technological revolution would continue to unfold in the decades following the Gulf War, reshaping warfare in ways both anticipated and unforeseen. as coalition forces withdrew from southern Iraq in the spring of 1991, celebrations gave way to a creeping realization. The decisive military victory had produced an ambiguous political outcome. Saddam Hussein remained in power, his most loyal military units had survived, and the fundamental regional security challenges remained unresolved. Operation Desert Storm had ended with a military triumph, but a strategic question mark. The immediate aftermath saw Saddam Hussein facing internal rebellions from Kurdish groups in northern Iraq and Shiite populations in the south. Having urged these populations to rise up against the dictator, American forces now stood by as Saddam's remaining Republican Guard units, using the helicopters permitted under ceasefire terms, brutally crushed the uprisings. The resulting humanitarian crisis, hundreds of thousands of Kurdish refugees fleeing toward Turkey, eventually prompted the establishment of no-fly zones and safe havens in northern Iraq. In Kuwait, recovery began amid environmental catastrophe. Hundreds of oil wells continued to burn, creating toxic black clouds visible from space. Kuwaiti officials estimated the cost of damage at over $100 billion. The societal trauma ran deeper, with thousands of citizens bearing the psychological scars of occupation, and hundreds more missing, presumed executed by retreating Iraqi forces. This context is drawn from The Economist's post-war assessment, which described the Gulf War as a tactical masterpiece, but a strategic puzzle that would haunt American policy in the region for decades. President Bush defended the decision not to march on Baghdad, arguing that such action would exceed the United Nations mandate and potentially fracture the carefully constructed coalition. Had we gone the invasion route, the United States could conceivably still be an occupying power in a bitterly hostile land, he noted in his memoir, words that would appear prescient in light of later events. For American military leaders, the war's rapid conclusion represented both a triumph and a missed opportunity. General Schwarzkopf later expressed regret at the hastily arranged ceasefire terms, suggesting another 24 hours of combat would have completely destroyed the Republican Guard divisions attempting to escape. Colin Powell defended the decision, articulating what became known as the Powell Doctrine, the principle that military action should have clearly defined objectives, overwhelming force, and a clear exit strategy. Throughout the 1990s, Saddam Hussein played a cat-and-mouse game with United Nations weapons inspectors, eventually expelling them entirely in 1998. The economic sanctions that had been intended as temporary measures evolved into a semi-permanent arrangement that devastated Iraqi civilian infrastructure while leaving the regime intact. Humanitarian concerns mounted as reports highlighted the suffering of ordinary Iraqis under the sanctions regime. For American veterans, the war's legacy proved complex. Initially welcomed home as heroes in contrast to the Vietnam generation, many later developed unexplained medical conditions collectively, termed Gulf War Syndrome. Debates raged over potential causes, from experimental vaccines and exposure to depleted uranium to chemical weapons releases and oil well fires, but conclusive answers remained elusive. In military circles, Desert Storm's overwhelming success ironically created dangerous overconfidence. The apparent ease of victory against a conventional opponent encouraged what some critics called the myth of bloodless war, a belief that American technological superiority could guarantee quick, casualty-free victories in future conflicts. This mindset would influence strategic thinking throughout the 1990s and into the 21st century. The unfinished nature of Desert Storm created a continuing entanglement with Iraq. American and British aircraft patrolled the no-fly zones for over a decade, regularly exchanging fire with Iraqi air defenses. The sanctions regime required constant diplomatic maintenance. By the early 2000s, many of the same officials who had managed the First Gulf War found themselves advocating for a return to Iraq to complete what they viewed as unfinished business. On March 19, 2003, American forces crossed into Iraq once again. this time with the explicit goal of regime change. The seeds of this second conflict had been planted in the ambiguous conclusion of the first. As one senior State Department official observed, Desert Storm didn't end in 1991. It merely entered a 12-year intermission. The lightning victory of Desert Storm thus cast a long shadow over American foreign policy, simultaneously demonstrating the unmatched capabilities of American military power, while highlighting the limitations of military solutions to complex geopolitical challenges. In this sense, the 100 hours of ground combat in February 1991 marked not the end, but rather the beginning of America's long entanglement with Iraq.